So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Jamaica Bay Colloquium session on Saltmarsh Sparrows. I'm Brett Branco, the Executive Director of the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, or SRIJB. We are a CUNY-wide institute hosted at Brooklyn College, and we work with New York City, the National Park Service, and an extensive network of partners to support the well-being of people and nature in and around Jamaica Bay through research, education, engagement, and training. Today's colloquium is part of a series of events on the state of Jamaica Bay. They're being held in partnership with the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy and the Jamaica Bay chapter of the American Littoral Society. And the purpose of the colloquium series is to explore current research and data that informs us of conditions and their trends in and around the Bay. So this is the third of 4 webinars that we've been doing this fall around the theme of wildlife. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to our co-host for the day, Alexandra Canonik from the American Littoral Society, who will introduce today's speaker and moderate today's webinar. So Alex, it's all yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Brett. All right, so let me introduce you all to our speaker for the day. Dr. Jonathan Cohen is Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at SUNY ESF. He has published 94 papers throughout his career focused on research in support of habitat and population management. His area of interest focuses on birds and mammals that are endangered or otherwise of conservation concern. Currently, Dr. Cohen supervises graduate research at ESF on tidal marsh sparrow conservation in New York City, which is a part of a larger consortium of work across 5 Northeastern universities and alongside state, federal, and nonprofit partners. If you want to learn more about this program, it is known as SHARP, which stands for Saltmarsh Habitat and Avian Research Program. You can Google it online, it's very easy to find. Today, Dr. Cohen will be speaking on his observations on marsh sparrows in Jamaica Bay over the last 12 years. And with that, Dr. Cohen, let's hand it off to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to talk today about research conducted by my lab, my graduate students, Allison and Alexandra, who put together a lot of these slides for me. I'm going to look forward to presenting them to you today. So these are the main characters of today's talk. The Saltmarsh sparrow and the Seaside sparrow, 2 sparrows in the same genus. They both rely, as I'll talk about some more, completely on salt marshes throughout their entire annual cycle. And I'm going to talk a bit about their biology as we go forward here. They are both endemic to North America. So the Saltmarsh sparrow, you can see they breed from Maine down through Virginia and maybe northern North Carolina, and they winter from New Jersey down to the Florida Gulf Coast. And then the Seaside sparrow, they don't occur quite as far north. Mostly the northern ranges, southern New England and New York. And then they do actually have year-round populations down on the Gulf Coast. But whether they are on their breeding grounds or whether they're in non-breeding parts of their range, they rely 100% on salt marshes. It's important to understand, in order to understand their habitat use, it's important to have a little bit of background on salt marsh structure. So usually there's an elevation gradient going from the water to the uplands in the salt marsh. And so the part of the marsh below mean high water is the low marsh, and there you have plants that are adapted to daily inundation. In the northeastern marshes that we have, the primary grass is Spartina alterniflora, smooth cordgrass. It gets quite tall. It's really stiff, and it's adapted to being underwater or having its roots submerged a good part of the day. And so this is where the Seaside sparrow lives. And so they are adapted to putting their nest in this tall, stiff grass relatively high above where the daily water comes in. But you can see they just weave their nest into the grass. So both of these are grassland birds, and they lay their eggs in this little cup. They weave it out of thatch, which is the dead grass. That's kind of a mat of dead grass that's under the live vegetation layer, and then they attach it to the stems of the live grass. So their strategy is to try and nest higher up in the, they nest in the low elevation part of the marsh, but higher up in the taller grass. They are a monogamous species, so the male and the female help with taking care of the eggs and the young. They're altricial birds, which means that after the eggs hatch, they're little helpless babies in the nest, and they have to be fed by their parents until they are able to fly. And so the higher elevation part of the marsh, which we call high marsh, it really is under ideal conditions only flooded during the highest tides of the month, the spring tides. And there you find grasses that are not as well adapted to being submerged all the time, but they're adapted to being submerged periodically. And so this is dominated by Spartina patens, Disticulus, and Juncus rushes, and they are thinner plants. They don't really stand up stiff and tall. They kind of droop over. And this is where the Saltmarsh sparrow typically lives. So you can see that they are their nests are much closer to the marsh floor. They tend to weave there. So you can see this area here, and you have to have the eyes of one of my grad students who search all the time to see a difference between this patch of grass and any others. But this swirl, where inside that little pocket they've woven their nest. So they are a high marsh species. So their strategy is to nest in the higher elevation part of the marsh where it doesn't flood as much, and then to be lower to the ground in this thinner grass. They are not monogamous. They are actually the most promiscuous bird species. The males just sort of fly around in flocks looking for mating opportunities, and the females, and they're not territorial at all. The females take care of the eggs and the young all by themselves, and almost all the females' nests have eggs that were fertilized by more than one, but fertilized by different males. And so there's just a look at the thatch layer. So that's the dead grass we're talking about that sort of forms the platform for their nests. And then at the highest part of the elevation of the marsh, we've got woody plants like Iva that are adapted to high salt conditions, invasive Phragmites, and then at the upper edge, we've got trees. And as in the face of sea level rise, the high marsh is facing inundation more frequently. And sort of in historical times, the marshes could migrate as the sediment got deposited further upland. But in the modern landscape, especially in somewhere like Jamaica Bay and New York City, there's nowhere for the marshes to go because the upland is developed with urban infrastructure. So they're kind of getting pushed. It's called a coastal squeeze. The marshes are getting kind of crushed up against the boundary and with no way to migrate. So we're potentially losing this high marsh. So these sparrows are very affected by the tide cycle. So they have to nest in between the highest tides of the month before the water rises up to where it could flood out their nests. And so everything's kind of a frenzy out there. So they have to basically lay their eggs, incubate them for 9 or 10 days, and then raise their chicks in the nest for another 9 or 10 days, and get it all done between the tide cycles. So they have about 3 chances during the breeding season in between the spring high tide. So if they fail in sort of May or June, they have to wait for the tide to come up and down again, and then they can try again. And they usually have 3 chances, but everything resets at that spring high tide, and any failures they had, they can try again. And also, if they succeed at raising chicks during one of these windows, they can nest again and try to raise more during that same breeding season. So yeah, everything has to happen between those tide cycles. So why would they nest in such a terrifying environment where everything is a frenzy and they have to do it? They have to try to nest in such a narrow window or risk losing their nest to floods. It's because, for one thing, the salt marshes are very productive. You may have heard this. They're among the most productive terrestrial ecosystems. It's been found in general that food is really not limiting out there. So once their chicks hatch, there's a lot of, so they eat insects and crustaceans, worms, other invertebrates. They bring back to their young. So there's a lot of food out there. And it's also thought that historically there weren't a lot of predators in these marshes. But in an urban place, now you've got a lot of predators that are commensal with human beings, attracted to human trash, or maybe they're just like something like feral cats that are released by people into the environment. So now in certain places, especially like Jamaica Bay area, you've got potentially higher levels of predators now coming off the uplands and water, rising higher and higher from the other side of the marsh. So now the sparrows are facing sort of this trade-off between making sure their nests are high off the ground so they don't flood, but then if they're too high up, maybe they get easily found by a predator. So this is a balance that the sparrows have to make in the modern environment. And so my colleague, as I mentioned before, I'm part of this consortium called SHARP, Saltmarsh Habitat and Avian Research Program. You can see the universities at the top there. So my colleagues at University of Connecticut did some population modeling, and they showed, first of all, there's been a documented 9% decline per year in the Saltmarsh sparrow breeding population. And what they also predicted is that sometime in the 2030s to the 2050s, the window during which they can breed is going to narrow to where they cannot reproduce anymore. So there's not enough time between those high tides where the water's low enough for them to breed, and so they are expected to go extinct. So that gives us the conservation problem of what can we do to try to restore marshes that are sinking in order to try to prolong the lifeline for this species. And why do we care besides the fact that maybe we just we view these sparrows as an important part of our natural heritage. They're a native, they're an endemic North American species. But they also are an indicator of marsh health. So where you find these salt marsh sparrows, it means that the salt marshes are providing the ecosystem services that we all benefit from. So millions of people live within 1 meter of sea level, and I'm sure most people here are familiar with the fact that salt marshes are buffers against storm damage for human infrastructure, and they filter pollutants. They're nurseries for fisheries. So where you have salt marsh sparrows, then you probably have marshes that are performing all these services. As I mentioned, here's a graph showing productivity of different terrestrial ecosystems, and you can see saltwater wetlands are among the highest in terms of the amount of productivity. So when we began this work, nobody had really studied the sparrow. We knew there were some sparrows that were seen nesting in and around the New York City area, but it was sort of considered suboptimal habitat compared to elsewhere in the range, small marshes, highly urbanized. And so we were interested in how were the sparrows persisting? What did their habitat selection look like? We also knew that sea level rise was proportionally sort of higher in the New York City area than some other parts of the range. So there hadn't been any research done since the 1970s in this area. So we really are looking for basic questions. What are the factors that affect where they put their nests? What are the disturbance levels like in the marsh, predators and human disturbance? How much prey was there? And then how well are they performing? How well do their nests survive? So this was work my master's student did in the early 2010s. Here's the sites. So there are some in and around Jamaica Bay, although so the red stars show places where we found salt marsh sparrows nesting. The blue stars are places where we found both species nesting, and the green is where we didn't find them. So around Long Island Sound, there are sparrows on Long Island Sound further up towards Connecticut, but we didn't find any in the marshes that we were looking. And also in the heart of the bay itself, we didn't find nesting sparrows, even though there were historical records of them being there. We did find them in this little tiny marsh called Four Sparrow off the west side of the bay, and Idlewild, which is adjacent to JFK Airport. And then we had some sites that were in Nassau and then over on Staten Island. So our first question was, what are the factors that determine where sparrows put their nests? And so to do that, you generally collect vegetation data and other habitat data at nests, and then you also collect them at random points selected throughout the marsh, and you compare the characteristics between nests and random points, and you look at, is there anything sparrows seem to choose out of proportion to what's actually available? So we looked at basal cover of different vegetation types, Spartina alterniflora, Peyton's other vegetation, and bare ground, that kind of thing. And then we used this MRPP routine to look at whether the composition of vegetation at nests was different from random points. And so this graph, what you should focus on first of all are sort of these major categories. So where you see a lot of red, so these bars represent the proportion of the habitat that was in these different vegetation types. And so this is just marsh characteristics. We're not looking at sparrow nests yet. The red shows low marsh zone, so alterniflora, Spartina alterniflora. The green stripes are high marsh, so Spartina patens primarily and Disticulus. And the blue is bare ground, and then we have some upland border. And the little sparrows are places where we had found nesting sparrows. And so what we can see if we look at the Jamaica Bay sites, for Sparrow Marsh, it was largely dominated by high marsh vegetation. It had some marsh restoration performed by New York City Parks a few years before we did our study. Out in Staten Island, there were these marshes that were also at high levels of high marsh vegetation. These sites also had some restoration that was done. Idlewild, largely low marsh vegetation and not much of what we would think of as salt marsh sparrow habitat. So lots of low marsh dominated sites in Jamaica Bay itself here. Now, when we compare what the sparrows are using to what's available, we saw some interesting things happening. I put a red oval around the Jamaica Bay site since that's kind of the focus of today's talk. So for Sparrow Marsh, even though this site was dominated by high marsh, which is what we think salt marsh sparrows like, they put their nests disproportionately in low marsh vegetation, so taller Spartina alterniflora grass. So they seem to be potentially using habitat differently than what we'd expect from what's known about their biology, and maybe that has to do with them trying to adjust to rising water levels. At Idlewild, where there isn't much high marsh, the salt marsh sparrows were doing what we thought they should do, which was seeking it out. So this green bar shows the proportion of high marsh around their nests, and here's the proportion that was just available in the habitat itself. And then also what we found out on Staten Island was that the salt marsh sparrows were selecting some of this upland border with woody vegetation. When we look at seaside sparrow habitat selection, seaside sparrows do not occur at nearly as many locations. But here in Idlewild, the seasides are doing what they should do. So here, this red bar over here is the proportion of low marsh at random area points in the marsh, but there's a much higher proportion of low marsh around their nests, which means that they're preferentially seeking out low marsh areas for their nests. Over in Staten Island, they were going where there wasn't much low marsh to choose from. They were doing something that seasides are not really known to normally do, which is nesting more where you find some of this upland border. We found seaside nests that were woven in such a way that they were attached to iva shrubs, which is pretty unusual. So sparrows are doing some things that we didn't really expect in these areas that may be considered suboptimal compared to sort of other parts of the range. So besides vegetation, there's other factors that could determine whether sparrows are present or not. One is possibly human disturbance, another is predators. So we did disturbance counts. These were point counts where we stood at a point in the marsh, and for 10 minutes we counted all these different potential disturbances, so predators of nests, predators of adult birds, and then human presence, pedestrians, machine noise, that kind of thing. And we sort of calculated how many disturbance minutes there were. So disturbances per unit time. And we found that sparrows tended to be in marshes that had lower levels of predators. So the green bar shows sites that contain sparrows, and the red bar sites that don't contain sparrows. And these show you the average number of disturbance minutes that we counted. So nest predators, these are things like blackbirds and wrens. There were fewer of them in the sparrow marshes. Things that might eat adult birds, crows and gulls and herons, there were less of those. And there were also fewer European starlings, which could be nest predators, but also just sort of take up a lot of space. So altogether, in general, avian predators were less common in places where we had salt marsh sparrows. As far as human disturbance, the places where we found sparrows had lower levels of pedestrians. There aren't many salt marshes where people like to actually walk into them. It's not something that really attracts people, but there were a few places that had things like boardwalks and places where you might have people coming in. And then the sparrows didn't seem to care much about machine noise. So Idlewild, I mentioned, had both species of sparrows. That's a place where you have airplanes landing a lot. And so places that had traffic noise and airplanes and other sorts of machine noise, they had sparrows pretty frequently. Another characteristic of the marsh we wanted to look at was prey, and whether we might explain sort of some of the sparrow's prey items, which are these invertebrates, might determine where we find them. These were sweep net surveys that we did, sweep net sampling. So doing sweeps to catch insects and other invertebrates. And then we actually measured every little organism that we caught to try to sort them into size categories. And so here's one result, which was looking at specifically the number of large prey that we found in the marshes in our samples. And we broke it down into high marsh and low marsh. So again, the green bars are where we had sparrows and the red bars are where we didn't. And then we had these two sets of bars for 2 years of sampling, 2012 and 2013. Looking at the high marsh, so we can see, first of all, that we got fewer samples in 2013, but our sampling effort was not as intense that year as it was in 2012. But these large prey items that they might bring back to their nest and feed their young, insects or invertebrates that are greater than half a centimeter, significantly more abundant in sites with sparrows than without in the high marsh, and then especially so in the low marsh. So sparrows are in places that have a lot of food, not many avian predators, and I should say the salt marsh sparrows, although they nest in the high marsh, they forage a lot in the low marsh. So when the tide goes out, they go and search for food down in the low marsh. And then one more thing was looking sort of outside of the marsh at the landscape scale characteristics. In particular, this case, what percent of the border of the marsh is urbanized and how big the marsh is. And for this, we had a bigger sample size because we could get remotely sensed data on this kind of thing from across Long Island. So we included areas from eastern Long Island that are somewhat bigger marshes and much less urbanization, trying to determine how that might affect where you see sparrows. So we characterized a buffer zone of 250 meters around each marsh and what percentage of that buffer contained urban land use. And we also extracted the size of the marshes. And we actually found that marsh size did not affect whether there were sparrows. As I mentioned, 4-sparrow marsh, extremely tiny marsh along the Belt Parkway there in Brooklyn. And it had sparrows at the time of this study. But urbanization was a pretty good predictor. So you can see these dots here with low levels of urbanization. Those are marshes probably out on eastern Long Island. And then as you get towards the city, the probability that a marsh will have a sparrow drops off with the percent urban border. And then so those are factors that affect whether sparrows would be there at all. And we wanted to look at how are the sparrows doing if they're in a marsh. So are they losing their nests to flooding or predators, or are they successfully raising young? So we searched for nests throughout the marsh, people walking sort of adjacent to each other and just trying to look for signs in the grass that there was a nest. When we found them, they were followed every 3 or 4 days until they either succeeded or failed. Here's one where there's the nest and there's some eggs that were clearly washed out of it by a flood, so they're not going to survive. Or they might have survived, and here's some young ones hanging out in the nest, and then they'd be followed until they can fledge. So there's a fledgling in the nest. And we collected the same kind of vegetation data as before to sort of try to relate nest survival to some habitat factors. This is one example of the result showing how the probability that a nest would survive is related to how high the nest is off the ground. It was a very significant factor. As you might imagine, the higher they are off the ground, the less likely they should be to flood, although it could maybe potentially expose them more to predators that are searching for them. There was a differential probability of surviving, whether for nests that were in the egg stage versus those that are in the chick stage. So these eggs, they can survive being submerged for about an hour, after which they would die. That's one of the reasons the sparrows kind of weave a canopy of grass over their nest to keep them from floating away, except for when the tide gets really high. The chicks, once they reach maybe 4 or 5 days old, they can climb up the grass when the water rises and then climb back down afterwards. So survival of that stage, if they make it to that stage, is a little higher. So here, just to putting a sort of vertical line at 14 centimeters off the ground so we can visually compare these. So you can see that in the egg stage, so the top two are results from 2012 and the bottom two graphs are from 2013. You can see that at 14 centimeters off the ground, survival is higher for chicks than for eggs, and the same thing is true in 2013. Each of these colored lines is a different site. So for Sparrow Marsh, which is one of the Jamaica Bay sites, it had only a couple and two or three pairs, two or three female nesting saltmarsh sparrows, but they did well there. They had the highest probability of surviving to fledge, as opposed to Idlewild, which is the blue line. They had the lowest survival. So so you can see that blue line there. So we can see that in these different conditions, we can have sparrows performing well, but there's at least this one site, and that's the site where we saw that salt marsh sparrows don't have a lot of high marsh to choose from at that site, and they're sort of selecting low marsh, and they weren't surviving as high as we'd like to see. Their nests weren't surviving. So sparrows nested in sites with really high human-machine noise levels, but nest survival was low in the noisiest marsh. That might not have anything to do with the airplanes. It was also a marsh where there wasn't a lot of high Spartina patens. There was a lot of food where we found them, and it was less common when you had more than 50% urbanization around the marsh. So they also seem to be doing some strange things, choosing habitat zones that are atypical for the species. So maybe these sparrows are trying different things as they're coping with rising sea levels. And nest survival was high, though, at least at one site for sparrow, when they were using a typical vegetation type. So at that site, they were picking low marsh, even though there was a lot of high marsh available. So potentially plasticity in their nest site selection may impact the extinction timeline. Maybe it'll buy us a little time to design restoration for this species. So for 2014 to 2020, we sort of backed up a little and said, let's try to put these results in context with what we see in the rest of the range. So we wanted to determine if sparrow nest site selection was affected by experience. So what explains sort of what we see? These sparrows seem to be experimenting in New York. One hypothesis we had was maybe if they lose a nest to flooding or to predation, they might change where they put their second nest. Remember I mentioned they could nest 2 or 3 times in a season. And we wanted to see whether how that compared to other places in the range. And then also to get the first sort of abundance estimates based on marker capture data and compare that to other sites in the range. And then we also, on a smaller scale, wanted to look at sites within our sort of New York area that were not so urbanized. So how does nest survival and nest site selection compare to our New York City sites to a place that is less urbanized? So here is the sort of large scale study area. We had sites, and the data here were collected by our partners in SHARP. The data in New York was collected by our lab, and they all shared it with us on things like habitat and nest survival for their sites. And then here's our more intensive area. We added to a couple of places we had done in 2012 and 2014, including Idlewild, this island off Nassau County, which is about as, there aren't any real pristine areas in New York City for sparrows, but about as close as you could get, no urbanization, surrounded entirely by water. So we hypothesized that following successful nests, the sparrow's next nest would have similar sort of vegetation composition and structure to the previous one. Following a flooded nest, we thought they might move to taller vegetation, such as alterniflora, or maybe to higher elevations where there'd be more patens. And following a predated nest, we thought they would maybe move to lower elevations, but nest in tall vegetation where they could hide their nest. So we had a bunch of nests where people were catching sparrows as part of different research projects and putting bands on them so that we could identify individuals. And so we had 452 saltmarsh sparrows over a 10-year period worth of data where we could tell that it was the same bird between 2 nesting attempts, and we could see if she changed her strategy. And we also had some Nelson sparrows, which are related to these species, but they only occur in the northern part of the range. They're not in New York nesting. And then 92 paired Seaside sparrows. So we compared habitat to data to between nests and random points for first nest attempts and for nest attempts that occur either after a success or a failure. And we had a bunch of variables. We divided the data into the northern region and the southern region because previous research had shown that sparrow nests in sort of New Hampshire to Maine are highly affected by flooding, whereas as you get to the more southern areas, which include New York and New Jersey, predators might start to play more of a role in nest fate. Flooding is still a threat, of course, but predators become a little more of a factor. So walking you through some of what we found. So this black line is the probability that a sparrow would nest as a function of the height of the vegetation around the nest. So again, choosing a nest site compared to random points. So this is the northern part of the range, and the gray part is for our part of the range, including New York. So a much stronger relationship with vegetation height for those first nest attempts before they had any experience that season with nest losses. If their first nest succeeded in the northern part, in the southern part of the range here where we are, there wasn't much of a change afterwards in the way they selected their nests. In the northern part of the range, their relationship with vegetation height became even stronger. That could be confounded with the fact that, of course, over the breeding season, the vegetation in the nests in the marshes are going to get taller overall. Looking here, again, I'm going to focus in the interest of time on the southern part of the range, since that contains our Jamaica Bay sites. So here, this gray line is the same as in the success graph. This is first nest attempts and their relation, the way that vegetation height affects whether they nest in a certain spot. After flooding, the relationship does what we thought it would do. It becomes much stronger. So they go to taller vegetation, but they didn't go to higher elevation parts. So we had these two potential things we thought might happen. Either they go to taller vegetation and nest higher up in the grass, or they go higher up in the marsh. They didn't really move higher up in the marsh. They stayed, they moved to taller grass. And over here, we see what happens if the nest was depredated. This is the gray is the first nest attempt. If the nest was depredated, their second nest attempt, they also had a strong propensity to move to taller grass. So they didn't move lower in the marsh to get away from where the predators were, but they nested in taller vegetation where they might be able to hide their eggs. If we look in contrast at the northern part of the range in New Hampshire and Maine, after a nest predation, they didn't change their habitat selection at all. They didn't really react to it. This is for seaside sparrows, which we only had in the southern part of the range. They don't nest that far north. So here's the first nest attempt, which is black, in black. And then here we saw that whether or not there was flooding or nest predation, they went to taller vegetation. So again, reacting to nest losses by going to taller vegetation where they might either nest higher up off the ground or else be able to hide their nest better in that dense grass. If their nest succeeded, their relationship with vegetation had actually got a little weaker. So sparrows can adjust their nest following a flooding event, and in the southern part of the range, they do adjust their strategy after predation events. So some of these marshes that might have elevated levels of predators, such as in New York City, we might need to consider predator management as a factor in addition to things like managing marsh elevation and planting vegetation to restore marshes. Nest structure, we didn't really find any effect. We didn't find that they moved different elevations with patons or anything like that, but nest structure, including vegetation height, was more important than any one sort of vegetation species. Next, as I mentioned, we wanted to also look at how the density of sparrows in our marshes compared to places that were considered more optimal for the species. And for this, we used a method called spatial capture mark recapture. We put up mist nets in different parts of the marsh, and we used GPS units to record the coordinates of each nest. And so throughout the season, we would trap 1 to 2 times a month at each of our sites. And so we would record when we catch a bird, not only the day that we caught it and whether or not we caught it before, but also where it was caught. And so this spatial capture recapture method, what it does is it uses sort of the positions of the captures to better estimate the probability of catching a sparrow as a function of how far you are from its probable center of home range. You should be catching a particular sparrow more frequently near its home range center than far away. So the spatial pattern of captures gives us information about our capture rate, and that capture rate is used to adjust the number of sparrows we catch to create an estimate of how many there actually are in the population. So here is here's some of our results. So the little squares are the estimates that we got from the spatial capture recapture, and each of these sort of panels is a different site. And the whisker bars are 95% confidence intervals on the estimate. And the main thing that I want to show is that if we look at our site, so North Cinder Island, which is sort of, we chose as to try to be a pristine site, it had a higher density of Saltmarsh sparrow males than any place else that was sampled in the range. So it seemed like we did choose a place that was really good for sparrows. And so the different colors are just different years. And so here we have Idlewild, which seems to be suboptimal habitat for the species, but the density there is pretty similar to other places in the range, actually. And males are, and this dash line is an estimate that different researchers performed using just counts, not catching and marking animals, but doing point counts. It's difficult to estimate abundance from point counts for this species because they're not territorial, so they don't sing that much, and when they do, it's really quiet. You can see that in a few places our estimates are quite a bit higher than they got by just doing counts of unmarked birds. For the females, you can see again at North Cinder Island. So females, of course, we're particularly interested in because they are the ones that lay the eggs and take care of the nests. North Cinder, again, density that's higher than most of the other places along the coast, and Idlewild pretty similar to these other places. For the females, our estimates were a lot closer to the count-based data. That could be because the females, they're not territorial either, but they do, since they take care of a nest, they do tend to stick to a certain part of the marsh, and that would make it easier to get a relatively accurate count from unmarked birds. So our mark recapture estimate kind of confirms the estimates they had for female saltmarsh sparrows. But the main thing is density of the sparrows in New York were greater than predicted from previous models and similar in Idlewild or even greater in North Cinder densities elsewhere. So that's a good thing. And same thing with females. They're about the same as other places. So the last thing that I want to talk about is comparing, is that sort of zooming in now on the New York area again and comparing sort of our urban sites to the North Cinder in terms of what are the factors affecting habitat selection by the sparrows and how well are their nests surviving. So again, here's the study sites for this part of it. We did this study from 2018 to 2020. And so here's our sites. So Idlewild, you can see in this image, very urbanized border next to JFK, so lots of potential human disturbance, both species of sparrows nesting there. Here's Marine Nature Study Area, which is in Nassau County, lower intensity at least, residential areas, and a golf course on one side, and a boardwalk going through that allows pedestrians to walk through. So there's a picture of the boardwalk. They really only had saltmarsh sparrows. One year there was one seaside sparrow there. And then here's North Cinder Island. And so not actually pristine because you can see all these historical mosquito ditches, but relatively untouched, except when we were doing our research there, we discovered there was a colony of nesting herring gulls and greater blackback gulls, which are predatory potentially on sparrows. And so now suddenly in our supposedly pristine site, we have this other factor we have to try to account for in our models of habitat selection and nest survival. These are areas, so I guess we put sort of for illustration places that there were nests of sparrows in and amongst this gull colony. So they were nesting right in it. We mapped all the gull nest locations as well as the sparrow locations that we knew of. And so the red dots are the gull colony. And you can see that both species of sparrow, Sal's in dark blue, Seaside's in light blue, are right amongst the gulls. And then we have them stretched out, going pretty far from the gull colony as well. This yellow star is sort of the geographic center of the gull colony. So now we need to include like distance to gull colony as a factor in some of our analysis. Looking at habitat selection, we did the same vegetation measurements we took before. We also took some measurements of openness of the marsh, which was shown in New Hampshire and Maine to be an important factor in sparrow habitat selection. So the angle to the horizon, the height of the tallest object on the horizon. And we also use RTK to look at marsh elevation. Looking at some site characteristics. So the dark black is Spartina alterniflora, which here's Idlewild. You can see still by 2018 is really dominating. Marine nature also is dominated by low marsh, but North Cinder has a good mix of low marsh and high marsh in our different plots. Here is what we found. So the first column is the urban site, and then the last column is the island. And we're looking at how the proportion of Spartina alterniflora affects whether or not a sparrow will choose it for their nest. And then we looked at this at both low and high elevation parts of the marsh. So seaside sparrows in the urban site, at high elevation parts of the marsh, they're strongly selecting for Spartina alterniflora. So it gets less common at higher elevations, so they're seeking out those patches. That relationship is weaker in the low marsh, and that's probably because alterniflora is actually everywhere in the low marsh. Interestingly, in high elevation parts of the marsh, salt marsh sparrows are seeking out Spartina alterniflora, and at low elevation parts, they're avoiding it. So again, we kind of saw this selection for high marsh in that first analysis in 2012, but when we break it down by elevation, we see that in the higher elevation parts of the marsh, they're looking for the tall grass. And maybe that's because there's more predators there. We don't really know. On the island, the seaside sparrows, they didn't really have a significant relationship with alterniflora, but we saw the same kind of thing where at the high elevation parts of on North Cinder Island, the salt marsh sparrows are also selecting for alterniflora. And remember, there's these gulls there, so they might be needing to hide their nest from those gulls. And so looking specifically at North Cinder Island and the relationship between proximity to the gull colony, we found that seaside sparrows, indeed, like at high elevation parts of the marsh close to the gull colony, very strong relationship with alterniflora. Excuse me. Whereas high elevation far from the gulls, there was a negative relationship with alterniflora. So the gulls are definitely affecting where they put their nests. I'm only showing the significant lines for saltmarsh sparrow. There wasn't really a relationship with alterniflora on the island, except a very strong relationship for high elevation sites near the gulls. The saltmarsh sparrows are putting their nests in that tall, stiff alterniflora grass that's sort of not usually considered their typical nesting habitat. So they selected for tall, rigid vegetation in areas that have high elevation, maybe to mitigate from floods. So here's a saltmarsh sparrow nest in that thick alterniflora grass, sort of atypical for them. So potentially their adaptive peak is shifting due to a lack of high quality patons, but also this need to hide from predators. So as marshes get smaller and sea level rise, all these tidal marsh species may be forced to occupy smaller patches. And as so, interspecies interactions like gulls and sparrows may force changes in habitat selection. The very last thing I'll talk about is what we saw for nest survival at the island and at our urban sites. And so again, there's this trade-off between keeping your nests up off the ground so they don't flood, but then also having to be hidden so that predators can't find you, and that the higher up you are in the grass, the more likely you might be to be found, and also the higher elevation part of the marsh you are, the more predators there are, because that's kind of where they stalk around. So we collected when we found, this was very similar to our 2012 study. We looked for nests, we monitored them until they either failed or succeeded. We collected vegetation data at nest and random points, elevation data. We also had tide water level loggers, so we could look at in the interval between when we last checked the nest and when it failed, what was the tide height, and we can compare that to local tide gauges to get exact tide heights. So here's just some characteristics that are important to note of the marshes. This is the tide heights and the elevations we measured. You can see amongst our sites, here's the island close to the gulls and far from the gulls. The elevation is really kind of similar amongst all of our sites. What's different is the tide heights get a lot higher at Idlewild. So the water levels get really high there. In addition, if we look at average nest heights, so how high are the nests off the ground, at our urban site, the sparrows are definitely putting their nests higher up off the ground in the grass than they are at our other sites. So it could be a response to that water level. I'm not going to get into all our model parameters, but just some of our results. You can see that average vegetation height did affect nest survival. This is with both species of sparrows kind of put together. The blue line is North Cinder and the red line is Idlewild. So a really strong relationship with nest survival and vegetation height at the island, a weaker one at our urban site. And we won't know for sure, but that could be because as they try to nest in taller vegetation to get away from the flooding, now they're exposed to predators. So that's something to continue to look into. And the other thing to point out here with the relationship between nest survival and tide height, that does just what you expect. As the tide gets higher, nest survival drops off pretty sharply. But you can see how bad it is at Idlewild. The lowest tide height there is higher than like the highest one at our urban and suburban sites. So nest survival is just low there all around. And then the last thing I want to point out is just this one panel on this graph. In the chick stage at the urban site, for nests that are low off the ground, when the tide is low, their survival is higher than nests that are high off the ground. But then as the tide rises, the two lines crisscross. So that could be yet another sign that maybe when the tide is low, it's better to be lower to the ground where you're hiding from predators. So these sparrows are balancing this risk of predation, which is elevated in the modern landscape due to human commensal predators and sea level rise that tends to flood out their nests. So we may need to actually rethink some of our strategies, which are to try to, for these sparrows, just try to create a lot of, historically marsh restoration is focused on creating low marsh, and it didn't really take into account bird habitat at all. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about trying to create more high marsh, and that's important. We need higher elevation parts of the marsh, but we might need to create a mix of both tall and short vegetation so they can choose what they need to. So raising the elevation of the marsh, planting grass so that there's a mix of vegetation types, and also potentially having to remove predators, and especially in our really urban areas. So there's a lot of restoration that's been, a lot of experimental restoration in the last few years that's focused on trying to create bird habitat. And I have research happening now that's kind of looking at the response of sparrows to different restoration techniques. So with that, I want to acknowledge all the many field technicians who assisted my graduate students in their fieldwork and the many agencies and organizations that provided us both funding and logistical support. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, John. That was fabulous.
And I also really wanted to thank Jonathan Cohen for providing everyone with such a great in-depth presentation. So in the chat, we have one question from Thomas. Do you think the reason there were more sparrows in areas with machine noise was due to the machine noise deterring predators and people?
Yeah, I think in general, like the marshes, a lot of the predators are avian species too. So I'm not sure they would be deterred by machine noise much more than the sparrows were. I think it's just, and people don't generally like to go into salt marshes unless you make a way for them to go in. So I think it's just that there's good habitat near some of the, I mean, it's hard to find areas in the New York City area, especially that don't have some level of machine noise. And there's just some areas of pretty good habitat, like Forest Sparrow Marsh is right next to the Bell Parkway, and obviously Idlewild is right next to JFK Airport. So I think there happen to be good habitat near machine noise, and it just doesn't deter sparrows from nesting there. And I've seen that with other songbird species. I worked a lot on forest songbirds and military installations, and noises like aircraft training that made me want to throw myself on the ground and cover my ears. The birds just kept chirping.
Thank you.
Sure.
And then in the Q&A, Grace Jennings asks, your data showed that when there are more instances of predators, that they selected for taller grass and higher vegetation nesting, but you were suggesting that higher nests lead to higher predation. Why is that?
Yeah, so I can't say we can't, all we have right now still are hypotheses. We haven't done any sort of experimental work. These are all observational correlational studies. And so there's sort of, pluses and minuses to going into the tall grass. And one is that that the minus is being higher off the ground potentially means that they're easier for predators to spot. But also the alternative flora, it's in most places where they nest, it's thicker. So it could also provide a benefit in that they can conceal their nests. So, so again, even within the trade-off, there's that trade-off, and it's a good question. I just, I don't really know, except for that they seem to, I would say this at North Cinder Island, they were nesting in that kind of tall vegetation in and amongst a gull colony, and their nest survival there was good. So something they're doing is working. And they seem to be selecting for that tall vegetation. So I think, at least in some cases, the benefits of being able to hide in that grass outweigh, maybe because their nests are concealed, being higher off the ground doesn't matter as much. Also, the other types of predators aren't as intense out there. So like there's that gull colony, but I don't think we saw any raccoons or anything out there, whereas they're extremely common in Idlewild. And so it could be, we saw that maybe nests that were in taller grass at Idlewild were more likely to fail during the chick stage. So they might be suffering some consequences of that trade-off.
Makes sense. I mean, all you need is one good raccoon who really knows what he's doing in order to hammer a bunch of nests. I know that well. Well, actually, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
I think in the restoration perspective, when people are restoring wetlands, have you been able to, like, with the body of work that you've done, kind of pinpoint to some types of plants that seem to favor like higher success to these sparrows? Because I've seen in other studies, I think on yellow warblers, where they actually were able to look at their diets and what they were feeding the chicks, the insects. So,
Mhm.
like there's certain types of insects that, they have host plants associations. So like some plants, like just being at the area, like really support them being able to feed their chicks better. Have you like been able to like think about that in your studies?
Yeah, we haven't really we haven't studied like that the foraging ecology to that degree and how just sort of the overall composition of plants in the overall marsh affects nest survival. I mean, what we could to do that, then of course the sampling area is the whole marsh, so you need a lot of marshes as opposed to like our small scale study where we were looking at points. Um, but yeah, we haven't really looked at that. I mean, there's not a huge plant diversity in the marshes anyways. So I don't know if there's sort of a tipping point where the mix of low marsh and high marsh crosses a point and they just can't do well anymore. You saw like in New York City, there was huge range of like mostly high marsh, and in some of those they didn't even do very well, and mostly low marsh. So yeah, I guess the answer is we haven't really looked at that in detail. Um, so my current grad student is looking at nest survival in relation to restoration features as part of it. So like runnels and parts of the marsh that have been restored versus not. So now we're kind of trying to look at more of like even within the marsh, like do they do better in different zones? Um, but I don't have an answer to that yet.
That's cool. I would be really looking forward to like what, your grad student comes up with from that study. All right. One question coming into the Q&A, Sixto Taveras Lopez, thank you. Do these sparrows prey on purple marsh crabs? I'm assuming that would be very beneficial for the sparrows to reduce the amount of grass the crabs eat and therefore improve the sparrows' chances of finding higher grasses for nesting.
Actually, don't know. I don't think that's not typically like crabs aren't typically listed under like the things they focus on eating. And I actually don't know much about the crabs, like how small. I mean, they're little sparrows. They eat small things by and large. So, yeah, I guess I would imagine if they could catch a small one and tear it to pieces, um, they might eat it. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really know specifically if they do. But mostly what I think of as their food is insects, worms, and crustaceans, and like, well, not crustaceans like crabs, but like amphipods or smaller soft-bodied things like that.
Thank you. I think I've opened up a can of beans. All right, one more question in the QA from Grace Jennings. How feasible is it to collect bird dropping to analyze their diets? There is a higher insect level where they are choosing to nest. Do you think that is significant to their survival, or is rising tides a more important factor to their success?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't we don't know, but I think it's generally considered that food is not limiting for them in these places. It wouldn't be that easy to collect their poop, but it could be potentially done at the nest. Um, so because they're pooping in the marsh amongst the grass, so it's not easy to get it. Um, so, but and when they're when the young poop in the nest, the mother picks up the fecal sac and carries it and drops it to keep the nest clean. So we don't have very long to do something like that. That one we did. Allison put cameras on some nests, some GoPros once to just sort of watch some of the nesting behavior, and so she saw that happening. She saw like the young poop and the mother pick it up and carry it away. So it was interesting to watch, anyways. But it seems most likely that food is of all the things we have to worry about, which is a lot of things. Food right now isn't one of them.
Very good. One more question in the chat from Andrea. Do stray cats have a significant impact on the sparrow population?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know at the population level, but in New York City, we have, I mean, for Sparrow Marsh, it was a place where for some years prior to our study had been used as a place where people would leave cats. Um, and the marsh was named because it used to have 4 species of sparrows, and when we were there, I think it only had 2, which was song sparrows and saltmarsh sparrows. And there was a saltmarsh sparrow incubating her nest who was killed, and we're not forensic people, but by the nature of it, we're pretty sure it was a cat that killed her on the nest. So they are a definite problem for most birds in most places, but yeah, definitely in our marshes, they could be a problem.
Okay. And Brett, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I have a question. And yeah, sort of right at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about like there's an urgency, right, to this problem for marsh sparrows. So, if we were able to create the right habitat for them for nesting, if we were able to design our restoration projects and maybe do some predator exclusion, um, how quickly would they tend to utilize that new habitat? In other words, is there time to do that, right? Well, if we build it, will they come?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the answer is we don't really know because there's been a lot of marsh restoration, in decades leading up to the present time, but almost none of it was done with bird habitat in mind, like creating a low marsh, especially because it was important for aquatic resources. And also creating marsh for its other ecosystem services to benefit like human infrastructure was the goal. And only in the past few years have people worried about this species because we see the rapid decline in the population. And then the focus has been on, well, maybe we need to create high marsh. And so everything being done for the salt marsh sparrows is relatively new, much too new for us to, and because marshes don't respond right away when you do restoration. It takes some time for the vegetation to grow in to be adequate, and there hasn't been enough time yet. So one of my colleagues has a paper that's going to come out soon where they looked at restoration projects post Hurricane Sandy up and down the coast and basically found that there wasn't evidence yet of a sparrow response. There was evidence of vegetation response. And then some things that we're trying are really new. So these smaller scale things so large scale projects into like spraying thin layer sediment deposition to raise the elevation of the whole marsh platform. But smaller scale things are like digging runnels, which are basically trenches to help the water drain faster, putting mounds of sediment out there to create just some, because it's really, really, really expensive to do marsh restoration, like hundreds of thousands of dollars an acre. So smaller scale, more affordable things, and those are so new that we really don't know yet. So, and you saw the rate at which the saltmarsh sparrows are declining and potentially going extinct in the next century. So we are in a race against time to try to figure some of these methods out. So yeah, I don't have a great or necessarily optimistic answer about that. And as far as optimistic goes, I'll say a lot of people care and are working on it. Both agency people who can put these things into action and scientists who are trying to help understand whether or not it's working. Um, so, uh, so yeah, there's a lot of people on the case, but we don't know yet whether it's going to work. The salt marsh sparrow itself has been a candidate for federal listing for quite a while now, but the decision keeps getting delayed. I think that the Fish and Wildlife Service was hoping we'd figure out some of these answers about response to restoration before they had to decide whether to list it. And so, but the decision still hasn't been made. In New York, they will be deciding either this year or next year, well, I guess 26 or 27, whether to add the salt marsh sparrow to the state endangered species list. They're redoing the bird and the mammal list, and I keep forgetting which one they're going to come out with first. But so yeah, it's on people's radars for sure. But we are not 100% sure yet we can do enough in time to help it. But some of the things that people are doing, like Sharp is doing, is like coast-wide, like the entire range, looking at potential habitat change maps with sea level rise, and then doing prioritization, like where are the areas where we think we can hold on to them for longer and focus resources there, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thanks for the bit of optimism too
Yeah.
that you provided at the end. Um, Yeah, and we're at time now. So first I wanted to thank you, Dr. Cohen, for that really fantastic webinar. We really appreciate you joining us today.
No, thank you.
And I wanted to thank Alex as always for co-hosting with me and Thomas this webinar. And I want to acknowledge the efforts of Thomas Morton in organizing this. Thomas is a master's student at Brooklyn College and does a lot of the work to sort of organize and the speakers and put this whole thing together. So thank you all, and please enjoy the rest of your day. See you next
Thank
time.
you.